Chapter 1. Before Indiana was Indiana. Long before Indiana had roads, cities, farms, or even a name, the land belonged to another world. Imagine standing in the middle of Indiana thousands of years ago. There are no highways cutting across the countryside, no Indianapolis, no Fort Wayne, no cornfields stretching to the horizon. Instead, vast forests cover the landscape. Towering oak, hickory, maple, and walnut trees create a green canopy so thick that sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. Rivers flow freely through the wilderness. Herds of deer move silently between the trees. Black bears roam the woods. Wolves howl in the distance. Eagles circle high overhead. The land is alive, and people are here. For thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, generations of Native Americans called this region home. They hunted, farmed, traded, built communities, raised families, fought wars, and developed cultures that would leave a lasting mark on the land that would one day become Indiana. Yet many Americans know surprisingly little about these first inhabitants. Their story begins long before written history. The earliest people arrived in what is now Indiana more than 10,000 years ago. They lived in a world that looked very different from the one we know today. The Ice Age had recently ended. Massive glaciers had shaped the landscape. Giant animals still roamed parts of North America. These early hunters followed game across vast distances, surviving through skill, endurance, and intimate knowledge of the natural world. Over thousands of years, these small groups gradually adapted to changing conditions. They learned which plants could be eaten and which were poisonous. They developed tools from stone, bone, and wood. They established seasonal settlements and built networks of trade that stretched hundreds of miles. Archaeologists today divide these early eras into the Paleo-Indian, Archaic, and Woodland periods. But for the people living through them, history was simply life unfolding generation after generation. Slowly, civilization began to emerge. One of the most fascinating mysteries of ancient Indiana involves a people known today as the mound builders. The term does not refer to a single tribe. Instead, it describes several cultures that flourished across eastern North America over many centuries. These people created enormous earthworks, massive mounds of soil carefully shaped by human hands. Some were burial sites. Others were ceremonial centers. Some served political or religious purposes that historians still debate today. Imagine thousands of workers carrying baskets filled with dirt, one load at a time. No bulldozers, no machinery, no metal tools, only determination. Generation after generation added to these structures until some reached astonishing sizes. Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of these ancient societies throughout the Ohio Valley. Artifacts made from copper, shells, and exotic stones reveal that trade networks extended hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. Objects from the Gulf Coast, the Appalachian Mountains, and even the Great Lakes found their way into communities in and around present-day Indiana. The existence of these mounds reveals something important. The first peoples of Indiana were not wandering groups living in isolation. They were organized societies capable of planning large projects, coordinating labor, maintaining trade relationships, and passing knowledge from one generation to the next. By around 1000 AD, another remarkable culture began to influence the region. Historians call them the Mississippians. Their civilization stretched across much of the central United States and represented one of the most advanced societies north of Mexico before European contact. The Mississippians built large towns centered around ceremonial plazas and platform mounds. They cultivated crops on a massive scale, especially maize or corn. Their trade networks connected distant communities across thousands of miles. Goods traveled from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Ideas traveled with them. So did stories. Indiana sat near the northern edge of this cultural world. While it was not home to the largest Mississippian cities, the influence of the civilization could be felt throughout the region. Farming became increasingly important. Communities grew larger. Trade expanded. The landscape itself began to change as forests were cleared and fields cultivated. For centuries, native societies shaped Indiana's environment long before European settlers ever arrived. The forests that later pioneers encountered were not untouched wilderness. They were landscapes managed by human hands. Native peoples used controlled burns to clear undergrowth, improve hunting grounds, encourage the growth of useful plants, and reduce the risk of massive wildfires. They cultivated crops near villages. They maintained trails that connected communities across vast distances. Much of what later explorers considered natural had actually been influenced by generations of native stewardship. To understand ancient Indiana, it is important to realize that these societies possessed sophisticated knowledge of their environment. They knew which plants could heal illnesses, which rivers offered the best fishing grounds, and how to survive harsh winters. Their understanding of the land had been developed through thousands of years of observation and experience. As the centuries passed, new peoples emerged across the Ohio Valley. Among the most important were the ancestors of tribes that would later play major roles in Indiana's history. The Miami became one of the dominant nations in the region. They established villages along rivers and fertile valleys. Skilled hunters, traders, and diplomats, the Miami developed extensive connections with neighboring peoples. Their villages often stood near waterways that served as the highways of the era. Canoes carried people, goods, and information across the region long before roads existed. The Potawatomi also became an important presence throughout the Great Lakes region and northern Indiana. Known for their adaptability and strong community ties, they built villages near waterways and participated in extensive trade networks. Their influence would eventually extend across much of the upper Midwest. Further east lived the Delaware, also known as the Lenape. Over time, conflicts and European expansion would push many Delaware communities westward, bringing them into Indiana. They carried with them traditions, stories, and cultural practices developed over countless generations. The Shawnee, renowned warriors and skilled leaders, likewise became a major force in the Ohio Valley. Their history would become closely intertwined with the struggle to resist American expansion during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, what matters is understanding that Indiana was never an empty land waiting to be discovered. It was already home. Generations of native peoples knew every river bend, every hunting ground, every fertile valley. They had names for places long before Europeans created maps. They possessed traditions, laws, spiritual beliefs, and histories passed down through countless generations. Children learned from parents. Parents learned from grandparents. Stories connected the living with ancestors stretching back centuries. The land itself became part of their identity. Every river held meaning. Every forest carried memories. Every trail told a story. Villages celebrated seasonal ceremonies. Communities gathered for trade and diplomacy. Elders preserved knowledge. Spiritual leaders guided their people through life's challenges. The rhythms of nature shaped everyday existence, from planting and harvesting to hunting and fishing. For thousands of years, this world endured. Then, near the end of the 15th century, events taking place thousands of miles away would begin to transform it forever. Across the Atlantic Ocean, European kingdoms searched for new trade routes, new wealth, and new opportunities. Powerful monarchs financed expeditions into unknown waters. Sailors crossed oceans that many believed impossible to navigate. At first, the peoples of Indiana knew nothing of these distant developments. Life continued much as it had before. Villages prospered. Hunters traveled through the forests. Farmers tended their fields. Children played beside rivers that had flowed through the Ohio Valley for thousands of years. Yet change was coming. A new era was approaching. The arrival of Europeans would bring trade, technology, and opportunity. But it would also bring disease, conflict, displacement, and profound transformation. Entire societies would be challenged in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. The world of ancient Indiana stood at the edge of a turning point. The first peoples of the Ohio Valley had built cultures that endured for centuries. They had shaped the land, established communities, developed trade networks, and created traditions that would survive even the upheavals to come. Their story is not merely a prelude to Indiana's history. It is the foundation upon which all of Indiana's history was built. Before explorers paddled through its rivers, before pioneers cleared its forests, before railroads crossed its fields, before Indianapolis became a capital city, and before Indiana joined the United States, there were already thriving societies here. They were the first Hoosiers in every meaningful sense. And although many of their villages have vanished and many of their stories were never written down, their legacy remains woven into the rivers, forests, and landscapes of Indiana today. To understand Indiana, one must begin with them. Because the story of Indiana did not begin when Europeans arrived. It began thousands of years earlier, with the first peoples who transformed a wilderness into a homeland. Chapter 2: French Explorers and the Fur Trade. For thousands of years, the forests, rivers, and prairies of what would become Indiana belonged to the native peoples who knew the land better than anyone else on earth. Generations had hunted its game, fished its waters, cultivated its fields, and traveled its winding trails. To them, this was not a wilderness. It was home. But in the 17th century, a new kind of traveler began to appear on the horizon. They arrived not on horseback or in wagons, but in long, narrow canoes. They came carrying metal tools, firearms, colorful cloth, glass beads, and stories of a distant world across a vast ocean. These newcomers were French explorers, missionaries, and fur traders, and their arrival would forever change the history of Indiana. To understand why the French came, we must first travel thousands of miles away to Europe. In the 1600s, European nations were competing fiercely for wealth, power, and territory. Spain had claimed vast lands in Central and South America. England was establishing colonies along the Atlantic coast. France, meanwhile, looked toward the interior of North America. The French were not initially interested in settling large numbers of farmers on the frontier. Instead, they sought something that Europe desperately wanted: furs. In particular, beaver pelts had become incredibly valuable. European fashion had created an enormous demand for felt hats made from beaver fur. The humble beaver had become a luxury commodity. Wherever beavers could be found, fortunes could be made. The waterways of North America became highways of opportunity. French explorers ventured deeper into the continent, navigating rivers and lakes that stretched farther than anyone in Europe had imagined. Among the first to reach the Great Lakes region were explorers such as Samuel de Champlain and his successors. Their reports described a vast interior, filled with forests, rivers, wildlife, and native nations eager to trade. Soon, French traders known as voyageurs became legendary figures. Tough, adventurous, and endlessly resourceful, these men paddled enormous distances through dangerous wilderness. Imagine spending months in a canoe made of birch bark. Rapids threatened to overturn your boat. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly. Storms could appear without warning. Food was scarce. Yet these voyageurs pressed onward, carrying trade goods into the interior and returning with valuable pelts. They became the lifeblood of France's North American empire. Indiana sat at a strategic crossroads within this growing trade network. Rivers connected the Great Lakes to the Ohio River and eventually to the Mississippi. Waterways that native peoples had used for centuries now became critical routes for commerce. The French quickly realized that success depended on cooperation with native nations. Unlike later settlers who often sought permanent control of land, French traders initially focused on relationships. They needed native hunters to supply furs. They needed native guides to navigate unfamiliar territory. They needed native allies for survival. As a result, the French developed partnerships with many tribes throughout the Great Lakes region, including the Miami and Potawatomi. Trade became the foundation of these relationships. Native communities exchanged valuable beaver pelts and other animal skins for European goods. Metal knives replaced stone blades. Iron cooking pots replaced some traditional containers. Firearms gradually supplemented bows and arrows. Colorful cloth, glass beads, and other imported items became highly prized. Both sides benefited from the exchange, though neither could fully foresee the long-term consequences. The arrival of European goods transformed native societies in ways both positive and disruptive. New tools increased efficiency. New trade opportunities brought wealth and influence. But dependence on European products also grew. Competition for access to trade routes intensified. Old balances of power began to shift. Meanwhile, the French established trading posts throughout the region. These were not large cities or military fortresses. Most began as modest outposts where traders could exchange goods, store supplies, and maintain relationships with nearby tribes. One of the most important settlements connected to Indiana's early French history was Vincennes. Located along the Wabash River, Vincennes would eventually become one of the oldest continuously inhabited European settlements in the Midwest. At first, however, it was simply another node in a growing network of trade and communication. The Wabash River itself became one of the most important arteries in the region. Flowing across Indiana, it connected communities and facilitated the movement of people and goods. Canoes loaded with furs traveled along its waters. Traders exchanged news and information. Alliances were negotiated. Deals were struck. Cultures met and mingled. The fur trade was not merely an economic enterprise. It was also a cultural exchange. French traders often lived among native communities for extended periods. Some learned local languages. Some married native women. Children of mixed French and native ancestry became part of a growing cultural frontier, where traditions blended and identities evolved. In many parts of the region, relationships were far more complex than simple categories of European and native. New communities emerged that reflected elements of both worlds. Catholic missionaries also accompanied many French expeditions. Among them were Jesuit priests determined to spread Christianity. These missionaries traveled extraordinary distances under difficult conditions. They established missions, learned native languages, and documented many aspects of native life. Their journals provide some of the most valuable historical records from this era. Yet missionary efforts were often met with mixed reactions. Some native individuals embraced aspects of Christianity. Others resisted foreign religious beliefs. Many sought ways to integrate new ideas into existing traditions. The result was a complicated process of cultural interaction rather than a simple story of conversion. As French influence expanded, Indiana became increasingly connected to events occurring across the continent. Trade networks stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. Goods from Europe flowed inland, while furs flowed outward toward international markets. What happened in a small village along the Wabash River could ultimately affect merchants in Paris. Yet beneath the prosperity of the fur trade, tensions were beginning to grow. Competition between European powers intensified. England and France both sought greater influence in North America. Native nations navigated these rivalries carefully, forming alliances and adapting to changing circumstances. Disease also cast a dark shadow over the continent. European illnesses such as smallpox spread through native populations that lacked immunity. Entire communities suffered devastating losses. Even in areas where direct European settlement remained limited, epidemics could travel through trade networks with tragic consequences. The demographic impact was enormous and would reshape the balance of power throughout North America. By the early 18th century, Indiana had become a vibrant crossroads where cultures, economies, and political interests intersected. French traders moved through native villages. Native hunters supplied global markets. Missionaries preached new beliefs. Children grew up speaking multiple languages. Canoes carried furs, goods, and information across thousands of miles of interconnected waterways. For a time, the French seemed firmly established in the region. Their alliances were strong. Their trade networks flourished. Their influence stretched across much of the interior. Yet, history rarely stands still. Beyond the forests and rivers of Indiana, larger forces were gathering. Rival empires eyed the continent. Competition for territory intensified. The fragile balance that had allowed the fur trade to prosper would soon be tested. The peaceful exchanges of trade would increasingly give way to military conflict. The world that French explorers and traders had built was about to enter a new and dangerous era. The next chapter in Indiana's story would not be defined by commerce alone, but by war. The struggle between France and Britain for control of North America was approaching, and Indiana would find itself caught in the middle of an imperial contest that would change the destiny of the continent forever. Chapter 3. Empires Collide. In the middle of the 18th century, the forests and rivers of Indiana stood at the crossroads of an empire. For decades, French traders, missionaries, and explorers had built relationships with native nations throughout the region. Canoes traveled the Wabash River carrying furs, supplies, and news. Trade connected distant communities. Villages prospered. For many people living in Indiana, life revolved around the rhythms of commerce, hunting, farming, and diplomacy. But beyond the horizon, powerful forces were gathering. Two of the world's greatest empires, France and Britain, were moving toward a collision that would determine the future of North America. Neither side was willing to back down. Both wanted land. Both wanted influence. Both wanted control of the vast interior of the continent. And when war finally erupted, Indiana would find itself caught in the middle. To understand why this conflict mattered so much, imagine a map of North America in the early 1700s. Britain controlled a string of colonies along the Atlantic coast. These colonies were growing rapidly. Their populations expanded year after year as settlers arrived from Europe seeking land and opportunity. France, by contrast, controlled a much larger territory, stretching from Canada down through the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi River to Louisiana. On paper, France possessed an enormous empire. Yet its population was relatively small. French leaders understood that they could not compete with Britain by simply sending more settlers. Instead, they relied on forts, trade networks, and alliances with native nations. Indiana occupied a crucial position within this system. Whoever controlled the waterways of the Ohio Valley could influence trade, military movement, and communication across vast regions. The land was valuable not only because of its resources, but because of its geography. Rivers acted like highways in an age before roads. Control the rivers, and you controlled access to the continent's interior. As British settlers pushed westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains, tensions increased. From the British perspective, the Ohio Valley represented an opportunity for expansion. To the French, it was already part of their sphere of influence. To native nations living there, it was their homeland. These competing claims were destined to collide. The spark came in the early 1750s. Both France and Britain began strengthening their positions in the Ohio Valley. Forts were constructed, troops were deployed, diplomats sought allies. The region became increasingly militarized. Then, in 1754, fighting broke out. The conflict that Americans remember as the French and Indian War had begun. Globally, it would become part of the much larger 7 Years' War, a struggle fought across Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America. Some historians even call it the first true World War. But for the people living in Indiana, the war was deeply personal. Villages, trade routes, and communities suddenly found themselves in the path of competing armies. Native nations faced difficult choices. This was not simply a war between Europeans. Indigenous peoples were major players whose decisions could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. Many native groups maintained alliances with the French because decades of trade and cooperation had built trust. French traders generally integrated into native communities more readily than British settlers, who often sought permanent possession of land. However, native leaders were not passive participants. They pursued their own interests, formed strategic alliances, and carefully evaluated which side offered the greatest advantages. Loyalties could shift depending on circumstances. Diplomacy became as important as military strength. Throughout Indiana and the surrounding region, forts became centers of activity. These outposts served as supply depots, communication hubs, and defensive positions. Messages traveled slowly through the wilderness, making local commanders responsible for critical decisions. A rumor, a delayed dispatch, or a misunderstanding could have enormous consequences. Life near a frontier fort was often tense. Soldiers worried about attacks. Traders feared losing access to valuable markets. Native communities monitored developments closely. No one knew how the conflict would unfold. The wilderness itself added to the uncertainty. Dense forests limited visibility. Rivers could either facilitate movement or become barriers. Armies struggled with logistics. Supplying troops hundreds of miles from major settlements was an enormous challenge. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion often proved as dangerous as enemy soldiers. Battles in the North American wilderness looked very different from the large-scale engagements fought in Europe. Small units moved through forests. Ambushes were common. Knowledge of local terrain could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Native warriors often possessed a significant advantage in this environment, using mobility and familiarity with the landscape to great effect. One of the most important realities of the war was that it disrupted the economic system that had tied Indiana together for decades. Trade routes became dangerous. Commerce slowed. Relationships built on mutual exchange came under strain. Communities that had once focused on trade increasingly focused on survival. As the war continued, momentum gradually shifted toward Britain. The British possessed greater financial resources, a larger population, and a powerful navy capable of cutting off French support from overseas. Major French strongholds fell one after another. The balance of power began to change. News of victories and defeats traveled slowly through the frontier, but the implications were profound. Native leaders who had long relied on French alliances faced an uncertain future. French traders wondered what would happen to their businesses. Settlers anticipated dramatic changes in territorial control. Then came the decisive moment. In 1763, after years of fighting, the war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris. France surrendered most of its North American possessions east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Overnight, the map of the continent was transformed. For Indiana, the consequences were enormous. The French era was effectively over. British authority replaced French authority throughout the region. Yet victory brought new challenges. The British soon discovered that governing the interior was far more difficult than conquering it. Many native nations had developed strong relationships with the French and viewed British policies with suspicion. Tensions rose almost immediately. In fact, the end of the French and Indian War did not bring lasting peace. Instead, it created new conflicts that would shape the next chapter of Indiana's history. Native leaders recognized that British expansion threatened their lands and autonomy in ways that French trade relationships often had not. Resistance began to grow. At the same time, British leaders attempted to limit colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains through the Proclamation of 1763. Ironically, many British colonists were furious. They had expected access to new lands after helping win the war. Instead, they found their ambitions restricted by the very government they had supported. These frustrations would eventually contribute to another revolution, the American Revolution. But that story still lay in the future. For now, Indiana stood transformed. The French flag that had flown over trading posts and forts was gone. British influence had arrived. Alliances were shifting, trade networks were changing. The old balance of power had collapsed. The French and Indian War had done more than decide which empire controlled Indiana. It had reshaped the destiny of an entire continent. The conflict marked the beginning of the end for French North America. Strengthened British dominance altered native European relationships, and set in motion forces that would eventually lead to the birth of the United States. In the forests and river valleys of Indiana, people could not yet see where history was heading. But they knew one thing with certainty. The world they had known before the war was gone forever. Chapter 4. The American Frontier. When the guns of the American Revolution finally fell silent in 1783, a new nation stood before the world. The United States had won its independence from Great Britain against extraordinary odds. Yet for many Americans, the Revolution was only the beginning of a much larger story. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains stretched an immense wilderness of forests, rivers, fertile valleys, and open land. To ambitious settlers living along the crowded eastern seaboard, this western frontier represented opportunity, freedom, and the promise of a better life. To the native nations who already lived there, it represented something entirely different. It was their homeland. The collision between these two visions would shape the future of Indiana and create one of the most dramatic chapters in American history. At the end of the Revolution, Britain officially surrendered a vast territory to the United States. On paper, this included much of what would later become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. The new American government called this enormous region the Northwest Territory. It was one of the greatest territorial acquisitions in the young nation's history. Yet there was one problem. Although diplomats in distant cities had drawn lines on maps and signed treaties, native peoples living in the territory had not agreed to give up their lands. As far as they were concerned, nothing had changed. Their villages still stood, their rivers still flowed, their hunting grounds still belonged to them. The Americans may have claimed the Northwest Territory, but they did not actually control it. The United States faced a difficult challenge. How could it govern such a massive region? How could it encourage settlement while maintaining order? In 1787, Congress passed one of the most important laws in early American history, the Northwest Ordinance. This remarkable document established rules for governing the territory and laid out a path for future states to join the Union. It prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, guaranteed certain legal rights, encouraged public education, and created a process through which territories could eventually become states. The Northwest Ordinance became a model for American expansion and remains one of the most significant pieces of legislation in the nation's history. But laws written in government chambers meant little on the frontier itself. Out in the forests and river valleys, reality was far more complicated. Settlers began moving westward in increasing numbers. Many were veterans of the Revolutionary War. Others were families seeking affordable farmland. Some were adventurers drawn by the promise of opportunity. They traveled along rough trails, floated down rivers, and established isolated homesteads deep within the wilderness. Life on the frontier was difficult. Settlers built cabins from logs. They cleared forests by hand. They planted crops in unfamiliar terrain. Disease, harsh winters, accidents, and food shortages were constant threats. Every day required hard work simply to survive. Yet despite these hardships, the frontier continued to attract newcomers. For many Americans, owning land represented independence and prosperity. The chance to start fresh was worth the risk. To native nations, however, each new settlement represented a growing threat. Tribes throughout the Northwest Territory understood that westward expansion was not merely bringing a few isolated families. It was bringing a new society determined to occupy the land permanently. Leaders from many tribes recognized the danger and sought ways to resist. The Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, and other nations began forming alliances. Although they spoke different languages and maintained distinct cultures, they shared a common goal: protecting their homelands. Their struggle would become one of the most important and often overlooked conflicts in early American history. Throughout the late 1780s and early 1790s, violence intensified across the Northwest Territory. Raids, counter-raids, and skirmishes became increasingly common. Frontier settlements lived in fear of attack. Native villages faced growing pressure from advancing settlers and military expeditions. Neither side trusted the other. The frontier became a zone of uncertainty and danger. The American government initially underestimated the strength of Native resistance. Leaders in the East assumed that a few military campaigns would quickly establish control. They were wrong. In 1790, the United States launched an expedition under General Josiah Harmar. His forces entered Native territory, hoping to crush resistance. Instead, they suffered a humiliating defeat. The following year, another army under General Arthur St. Clair advanced into the region. What happened next shocked the nation. In November 1791, Native warriors led by leaders including Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee launched a devastating attack. St. Clair's army was overwhelmed. More than 600 American soldiers were killed. It remains one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the United States Army at the hands of Native forces. News of the disaster spread rapidly across the young nation. Americans were stunned. The frontier was proving far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Native resistance was not collapsing. It was winning. For a time, it seemed entirely possible that the Northwest Territory might remain beyond American control. Determined to reverse the situation, President George Washington ordered the creation of a new and more professional military force. Leadership was given to General Anthony Wayne, a disciplined and experienced commander known for his toughness. Wayne spent years training his troops before advancing into the territory. Unlike earlier commanders, he understood that preparation was essential. By 1794, Wayne's army was ready. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near present-day Toledo, Ohio. Native warriors fought fiercely, but Wayne's well-trained force ultimately prevailed. The defeat weakened the Native Confederation and altered the balance of power throughout the region. The following year, representatives of several tribes signed the Treaty of Greenville. The treaty forced Native nations to surrender large areas of land, including portions of present-day Indiana. It also opened the door for increased American settlement. For many Native leaders, the treaty represented a painful compromise. They hoped it would preserve peace and protect at least some of their remaining lands. Yet settlement continued to accelerate. American communities expanded deeper into the frontier. New roads were established. Trade increased. Towns began to emerge. Indiana stood at the center of these transformations. At the same time, tensions remained unresolved. Many Native leaders believed that the loss of land could not continue indefinitely. Younger generations grew increasingly frustrated. They watched as settlers occupied territories their ancestors had lived on for centuries. They saw treaties repeatedly reduce Native lands. They questioned whether peaceful accommodation was even possible. The frontier may have grown quieter after the Treaty of Greenville, but it was not truly at peace. Beneath the surface, a new movement was beginning to take shape. A generation of Native leaders was emerging that would challenge American expansion with renewed determination. Among them was a young Shawnee leader whose name would soon become famous across the continent. His name was Tecumseh. His story and the dramatic struggle he would lead would soon place Indiana at the center of another historic conflict. The Northwest Territory had opened the door to American expansion, but it had also created a struggle that was far from over. The forests, rivers, and prairies of Indiana remained contested ground. Settlers dreamed of opportunity. Native nations fought to preserve their homelands. The future of the frontier was still uncertain, and some of the most dramatic chapters in Indiana's history had yet to be written. Chapter 5. Tecumseh's Last Stand. As the 19th century dawned, the forests and river valleys of Indiana stood at a crossroads. American settlers continued to move westward. New farms appeared where forests once stood untouched. Roads pushed deeper into the wilderness. Towns expanded. Treaties transferred more and more native land into American hands. To many Americans, this was progress. To many native peoples, it looked like the slow destruction of their world. For decades, native nations had watched their territories shrink. They had fought wars, signed treaties, and made compromises. Yet the pressure never stopped. Every year seemed to bring more settlers and more demands for land. Many native leaders began to ask a difficult question. If accommodation had failed, what options remained? Out of this crisis emerged one of the most remarkable figures in American history. His name was Tecumseh. To this day, he is remembered not only as a great Shawnee leader, but as one of the most gifted political and military leaders ever produced by North America. Tecumseh was born around 1768, during a turbulent era. From an early age, he witnessed the violence and disruption caused by expanding settlement. He saw native communities displaced. He saw villages destroyed. He saw treaties strip away lands that had belonged to native peoples for generations. These experiences shaped his worldview and convinced him that something had to change. Unlike many leaders who focused only on their own tribe, Tecumseh thought on a continental scale. He believed that native nations faced a common threat and that only unity could save them. His vision was ambitious. He wanted to create a vast confederation of tribes stretching across the interior of North America. Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Kickapoo, Ottawa, and many others would stand together. If united, they might possess the strength necessary to halt American expansion. If divided, they would almost certainly lose their lands one by one. Tecumseh's dream was bold, but he understood that military strength alone would not be enough. He needed a movement capable of inspiring people. Fortunately for him, another powerful figure was emerging at the same time. This was his younger brother, Tenskwatawa. Tenskwatawa's early life gave little indication of his future importance. For many years, he struggled to find a meaningful role within his community. Then, after a profound spiritual experience, everything changed. He began preaching a message of renewal and resistance. He urged native peoples to reject alcohol, abandon dependence on European goods, and return to traditional values and practices. His followers came to believe that he possessed spiritual powers. They called him the Prophet. Tenskwatawa's message spread rapidly throughout the frontier. At a time of uncertainty and hardship, many people found hope in his vision. Villages sent representatives to hear him speak. Followers traveled long distances to join his growing movement. Soon, the Prophet and Tecumseh combined their efforts. Tenskwatawa provided spiritual leadership. Tecumseh provided political and military leadership. Together, they created one of the most influential native movements in American history. Their center of operations became a settlement known as Prophetstown, located near the junction of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers in present-day Indiana. Prophetstown quickly grew into a thriving community. Native people from numerous tribes gathered there. Different languages could be heard. Different traditions blended together. It became more than a village. It became a symbol of resistance. To supporters, Prophetstown represented hope for the future. To American officials, it represented a growing threat. One man in particular watched developments with increasing concern. His name was William Henry Harrison. Harrison served as governor of the Indiana Territory and was responsible for negotiating treaties with native nations. He believed that American settlement was inevitable and that additional land would be required. Tecumseh strongly disagreed. The conflict between these two men would become one of the defining struggles of the frontier. In 1809, Harrison negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne. Through the agreement, several tribes ceded millions of acres of land to the United States. Harrison considered the treaty a major success. Tecumseh considered it illegitimate. He argued that no single tribe had the right to sell land that belonged collectively to all native nations. If the land was shared, then all tribes needed to consent before any sale could occur. This disagreement struck at the heart of Tecumseh's vision. During a dramatic meeting with Harrison in 1810, Tecumseh challenged the treaty directly. Witnesses described a tense confrontation. Tecumseh spoke passionately and forcefully. At one point, the atmosphere became so heated that violence seemed possible. Although no fighting broke out, both sides left the meeting knowing that compromise would be difficult. Over the next year, Tecumseh traveled extensively throughout the region. He visited tribes across the Midwest and the South, seeking support for his confederation. He delivered powerful speeches urging unity. He warned that continued division would lead to disaster. Many leaders admired him. Some joined his cause, others remained cautious. While Tecumseh traveled, tensions in Indiana continued to rise. Harrison concluded that Prophetstown posed an unacceptable threat. In 1811, he assembled a force of approximately 1,000 soldiers and militia and marched toward the settlement. Tecumseh was absent during this critical moment, still working to build alliances elsewhere. Leadership at Prophetstown fell largely to Tenskwatawa. As Harrison's army approached, both sides prepared for a possible confrontation. The situation was extremely dangerous. A single mistake could trigger war. On the evening of November 6, 1811, Harrison's forces camped near Prophetstown. The following morning would become one of the most famous days in Indiana history. Before dawn on November 7th, native warriors launched an attack against the American camp. The Battle of Tippecanoe had begun. Fighting erupted in darkness. Gunfire echoed through the forest. Soldiers scrambled to form defensive lines. Warriors struck fiercely and repeatedly. For hours, chaos dominated the battlefield. Eventually, Harrison's larger force managed to hold its position. As daylight increased and ammunition ran low, native forces withdrew. Militarily, the battle was relatively small compared to later conflicts. Yet its consequences were enormous. Harrison claimed victory and advanced to Prophetstown, which was abandoned and subsequently destroyed. The symbolic impact was devastating. The movement that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa had spent years building suffered a major setback. The loss of Prophetstown weakened the Confederation and damaged Tenskwatawa's reputation among some followers. Yet Tecumseh refused to surrender. He continued seeking allies and preparing for future resistance. Soon, a new opportunity emerged. Relations between the United States and Great Britain were deteriorating rapidly. In 1812, war broke out between the two nations. Tecumseh recognized that British support could strengthen the native cause. He allied with Britain and became one of its most valuable partners in the Western theater of the conflict. His military leadership earned widespread respect even among his enemies. American officers who opposed him often admired his intelligence, courage, and strategic skill. Yet the odds remained daunting. As the War of 1812 progressed, British fortunes declined. The alliance that Tecumseh depended upon grew increasingly fragile. Then came the decisive moment. In October 1813, at the Battle of the Thames in present-day Ontario, British and native forces faced advancing American troops. During the fighting, Tecumseh was killed. News of his death spread quickly across the frontier. For many native peoples, it marked the end of a dream. The Confederation that Tecumseh had worked so tirelessly to build could not survive without him. His vision of a united native resistance faded, and American expansion accelerated. Yet Tecumseh's legacy endured. Even his opponents recognized his greatness. He had understood the challenges facing native nations more clearly than almost anyone else of his era. He had attempted something extraordinary: to unite diverse peoples in defense of their lands, cultures, and future. Although he ultimately failed to stop American expansion, his leadership left a lasting impression on history. Today, Tecumseh is remembered as one of the most respected native leaders ever to walk the North American frontier. His story is not merely one of defeat. It is a story of courage, vision, determination, and resistance against overwhelming odds. Along the rivers and forests of Indiana, where his movement once flourished, the memory of Tecumseh still echoes. His last stand helped shape the future of the region and marked the end of one era as another began. The frontier that emerged after his death would soon move rapidly toward statehood, settlement, and the creation of a new American society. Indiana's next chapter was about to begin. Chapter 6. Indiana joins the Union. When Tecumseh fell at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, more than a great leader died. His death marked the end of the most powerful organized resistance to American expansion in the Indiana frontier. For decades, native nations had fought to protect their homelands from the steady advance of settlers. Now the balance of power had shifted decisively. The forests, rivers, and fertile valleys of Indiana were about to experience a transformation unlike anything in their history. The frontier was becoming a state. To understand the scale of this change, imagine traveling through Indiana in the years immediately after the War of 1812. Much of the land remained covered by dense forests. Wolves still roamed the wilderness. Bears could be encountered in remote areas. Roads were few and often little more than muddy paths cut through the trees. Settlements were scattered and isolated. Yet every month seemed to bring new arrivals. Families from Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and other eastern states packed their belongings into wagons and headed west. Some traveled by river. Others followed rough trails through the wilderness. Nearly all shared a common dream. They wanted land. In the early 19th century, land represented opportunity, independence, and wealth. A man who owned a farm could provide for his family and build a future for his children. The rich soil of Indiana promised exactly that. Stories spread about fertile farmland, abundant game, and endless possibilities. Whether those stories were entirely accurate hardly mattered. The promise of a better life drew thousands of pioneers westward. Population growth was astonishing. In 1800, only a few thousand non-native settlers lived in what would become Indiana. By 1815, the number had grown dramatically. New communities appeared across the territory. Cabins became villages, villages became towns. What had once been remote frontier outposts now buzzed with activity. The rapid growth created an important question. Should Indiana remain a territory, or was it ready to become a state? Under the Northwest Ordinance, territories could eventually join the Union once they reached sufficient population and established functioning governments. Many Indiana residents believed that time had arrived. Statehood offered greater self-government, political representation, and control over local affairs. Territorial leaders began pushing for admission into the United States. In 1816, delegates gathered in Corydon, then the territorial capital, to draft a state constitution. The scene was both ambitious and surprisingly humble. The convention met in a simple building on the frontier, surrounded by forests and farmland. Yet the decisions made there would shape the future of Indiana for generations. The delegates debated laws, government structure, and individual rights. They created a framework for a new state that reflected both frontier realities and American ideals. One important feature of the Constitution was its prohibition of slavery. Although Indiana bordered slave-holding Kentucky across the Ohio River, the state followed the principles established by the Northwest Ordinance and entered the Union as a free state. This decision would later play a significant role in Indiana's identity and politics. Once the Constitution was completed, Congress approved Indiana's request for statehood. On December 11, 1816, Indiana officially became the 19th state in the United States. For settlers across the region, it was a moment of celebration. Bonfires were lit, speeches were delivered, communities marked the occasion with pride. Indiana had completed the journey from frontier territory to full statehood. Yet becoming a state was the easy part. Building one was much harder. The new government faced enormous challenges. Roads were scarce. Communication was slow. Many communities remained isolated for weeks at a time, especially during bad weather. The state needed courts, schools, public services, and infrastructure. Officials had to govern a growing population spread across a vast area of difficult terrain. Money was often in short supply. Every decision carried significant consequences. One of the first questions involved the location of the state capital. Corydon had served as the territorial capital, but many leaders believed it was too far south. As settlement expanded northward, officials wanted a more central location. After considerable debate, a new site was chosen in the middle of the state. At the time, it was little more than wilderness. Surveyors laid out streets and plans for a future city. That city would become Indianapolis. Today, it is one of the largest cities in the Midwest, but in the early 1820s, it existed mostly on paper. Visitors often joked that the capital was surrounded by more trees than people. Creating towns was another major task. New communities needed homes, businesses, churches, mills, and schools. Life on the frontier demanded cooperation. Neighbors helped one another raise barns, harvest crops, and build roads. Communities organized social gatherings, religious services, and local governments. The frontier could be harsh and unforgiving, but it also fostered strong bonds among settlers. Daily life required constant labor. Clearing land was perhaps the most difficult task of all. Indiana's forests were magnificent, but they stood directly in the way of farming. Pioneers spent months cutting trees, removing stumps, and preparing fields. The work was exhausting. A family might labor for years before transforming a forested plot into a productive farm. Yet the rewards could be substantial. Indiana's soil proved exceptionally fertile. Corn, wheat, and other crops flourished. Agriculture quickly became the foundation of the state's economy. transportation remained a persistent challenge. Before railroads and modern highways, moving goods could be incredibly difficult. Farmers often struggled to get their crops to market. Rivers provided important transportation routes, but many areas lacked easy access to waterways. State leaders understood that economic growth depended on better infrastructure. The desire to connect communities and improve transportation would soon inspire ambitious projects that transformed Indiana's landscape. Education also became a priority. Many settlers believed strongly in the importance of schooling. The Northwest Ordinance had encouraged public education, and Indiana sought to continue that tradition. Schools were often simple log buildings with basic furnishings, but they represented an investment in the future. Parents wanted their children to have opportunities that earlier generations had lacked. Meanwhile, relations with native peoples continued to shape life in the new state. Although large-scale organized resistance had diminished after Tecumseh's death, native communities remained present throughout Indiana. Additional treaties transferred more land to the United States, and increasing numbers of settlers moved into areas once occupied by native nations. These developments brought profound changes and often painful consequences for indigenous peoples whose connections to the land stretched back thousands of years. By the 1820s, Indiana was no longer merely a frontier outpost. It was a growing state with expanding farms, developing towns, and increasing political influence. New immigrants continued arriving. Businesses emerged, trade expanded, optimism filled many communities. People believed they were building something lasting. Looking back, it is easy to see Indiana's admission to the Union as inevitable. Yet for the people who lived through it, nothing felt certain. They faced disease, isolation, financial hardship, harsh weather, and countless unknowns. Every farm cleared from the forest represented years of labor. Every town reflected the hopes and sacrifices of its residents. Statehood was not simply a legal milestone. It was the result of thousands of ordinary people working to transform wilderness into communities. Their efforts laid the foundation for modern Indiana. But even as farms expanded and towns multiplied, a new challenge was emerging. The state needed roads, canals, and transportation networks capable of supporting its growing economy. Ambitious leaders believed they could connect Indiana to the wider world and unlock extraordinary prosperity. Their dreams would launch one of the most dramatic periods of growth in Indiana history. The age of canals, railroads, and economic transformation was about to begin. Chapter 7. Abraham Lincoln's Indiana Years. When most people think of Abraham Lincoln, they picture the tall president who guided the United States through the Civil War, delivered the Gettysburg Address, and helped end slavery. They imagine the statesman standing in Washington, making decisions that would shape the fate of a nation. But long before he became one of the most famous Americans in history, Abraham Lincoln was simply a frontier boy growing up in the forests of southern Indiana. He had no wealth, no political connections, and little formal education. His family lived in a world of hard labor, uncertainty, and struggle. Yet it was here, in the wilderness of Indiana, that many of the qualities that would later define Lincoln began to take shape. If we want to understand how a poor frontier child became one of the greatest presidents in American history, we must begin not in the White House, but in a small clearing in the woods near Pigeon Creek. In 1816, the same year Indiana became a state, 7-year-old Abraham Lincoln arrived with his family from Kentucky. His father, Thomas Lincoln, hoped to build a better future on the Indiana frontier. Like many settlers of the era, he was drawn by the promise of affordable land and new opportunities. The journey itself was difficult. The family crossed the Ohio River and entered a landscape dominated by dense forests and rugged terrain. There were few roads and even fewer comforts. This was not a place for people seeking an easy life. It was a place for people willing to work. The Lincolns settled in what is now Spencer County, near a small community called Pigeon Creek. Their first shelter was little more than a crude structure built from logs and open on one side. It offered minimal protection from the elements. Winters could be harsh. Summers brought heat, insects, and disease. Every day involved physical labor. Trees had to be cut, land had to be cleared, crops had to be planted. Survival depended on constant effort. Young Abraham quickly became familiar with the demands of frontier life. He learned to swing an axe, split rails, and perform the countless chores required on a farm. The work was exhausting and often repetitive. Yet these experiences helped develop the physical strength and endurance for which Lincoln later became known. He grew into an unusually tall and powerful young man, eventually reaching 6 feet 4 inches in height. Neighbors often remarked on his strength, but they also noticed something else. Even as a boy, Abraham seemed different. While many frontier children focused entirely on practical skills, Lincoln displayed an unusual curiosity about the world. He wanted to understand things. He asked questions. Most importantly, he loved books. This passion presented a challenge because books were rare on the frontier. Schools existed only intermittently, and Lincoln's total formal education amounted to perhaps a year or less, spread across several short periods. By modern standards, his schooling was almost non-existent. Yet he refused to let that stop him. Whenever he could find a book, he read it. He borrowed books from neighbors, friends, and anyone willing to lend one. He read by firelight after long days of labor. He copied passages onto wooden boards when paper was unavailable. He studied every subject he could find. History, law, religion, literature, science, and mathematics all captured his attention. In many ways, Lincoln became his own teacher. The frontier may have lacked schools, but it could not prevent a determined mind from learning. Then tragedy struck. In 1818, only 2 years after arriving in Indiana, Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, became ill. The frontier was a dangerous place where disease often spread quickly and medical care was limited. Nancy likely died from milk sickness, a condition caused by consuming dairy products from cows that had eaten a poisonous plant known as white snake root. Today, the disease is largely forgotten, but in the early frontier, it claimed many lives. Abraham was only 9 years old when his mother died. The loss devastated him. Years later, he would speak of her influence with deep affection and respect. Historians believe her death left a lasting emotional mark on the future president. For a time, the Lincoln household struggled. Then Thomas Lincoln made a decision that would prove enormously important. He returned to Kentucky and married Sarah Bush Johnston. When she arrived in Indiana, she brought not only her own children, but also warmth, stability, and encouragement. Sarah quickly formed a close bond with Abraham. She recognized his intelligence and supported his love of reading. Throughout his life, Lincoln spoke highly of his stepmother and credited her with helping shape his character. Her arrival marked a turning point during a difficult period. As Abraham entered his teenage years, he continued balancing physical labor with intellectual curiosity. On the frontier, work came first. Family survival depended upon it. Yet Lincoln never abandoned his commitment to learning. He read whenever possible. He listened carefully to conversations and debates. He developed a remarkable ability to remember information and explain ideas clearly. These talents would later become essential in politics and law. Another quality also began to emerge. Lincoln possessed a gift for storytelling. Neighbors often gathered to hear him speak. He could make people laugh with humorous tales or capture their attention with thoughtful observations. Even as a young man, he demonstrated an ability to connect with ordinary people. This talent would later help him communicate with millions of Americans during some of the nation's darkest hours. Frontier life also exposed Lincoln to a variety of perspectives. Indiana sat near the border between free and slave states. Travelers, settlers, merchants, and laborers brought different opinions and experiences. Lincoln observed these debates closely, although his views on slavery would continue evolving throughout his life. Many historians believe his Indiana years played an important role in shaping his moral outlook. Living in a free state while maintaining connections to Kentucky gave him a unique perspective on issues that would later divide the nation. By his late teens, Lincoln had become known throughout the community as a hard-working and trustworthy young man. He worked on farms, assisted neighbors, and occasionally took jobs that brought him into contact with new people and ideas. Yet he increasingly felt constrained by frontier life. His ambitions extended beyond clearing fields and harvesting crops. He wanted to see more of the world. In 1830, after spending 14 formative years in Indiana, the Lincoln family moved west again, this time to Illinois. Abraham was 21 years old. He left Indiana with little money and no formal credentials. Few people could have predicted his future. He seemed like countless other young men seeking opportunities on the expanding American frontier. Yet beneath the surface, something extraordinary had taken shape. The forests of Indiana had helped create a leader. The hardships of frontier life had taught resilience. The loss of his mother had taught empathy. Years of labor had taught discipline. Endless reading had expanded his mind. The challenges of the frontier had prepared him for larger struggles ahead. In Illinois, Lincoln would become a store clerk, surveyor, soldier, lawyer, legislator, and eventually president. He would lead the United States through civil war and preserve the Union during its greatest crisis. Yet the foundations of that remarkable journey were built in Indiana. Long before he stood before crowds in Washington, he walked the trails of Pigeon Creek. Long before he wrote speeches that would inspire generations, he sat beside a frontier fire reading borrowed books. Long before he became Abraham Lincoln the president, he was Abraham Lincoln the frontier boy. And in many ways, the lessons he learned in Indiana never left him. The wilderness that challenged him also shaped him. The frontier that tested him also prepared him. Indiana did not merely witness Lincoln's childhood. It helped create the man who would one day help save a nation. Chapter 8. Canals, Railroads, and the Rise of a State. When Indiana entered the Union in 1816, it was still very much a frontier state. Thick forests covered much of the landscape. Small settlements were scattered across vast distances. Roads were often little more than muddy trails that became nearly impassable after rain. Farmers could grow crops, but getting those crops to market was another challenge entirely. A wagon loaded with corn might take days or even weeks to reach a major trading center. Transportation was slow, expensive, and unreliable. Yet Indiana's leaders understood something important. The future prosperity of the state depended on connections. If Indiana could link its farms, towns, and businesses to the growing markets of the United States, extraordinary opportunities awaited. The question was how to make it happen. In the early 19th century, the answer seemed obvious. Build canals. Today, canals may seem quaint compared to highways and airports, but during the 1820s and 1830s, they represented cutting-edge technology. Across the young United States, canals were transforming transportation. The most famous example was the Erie Canal in New York. Completed in 1825, it connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean and dramatically reduced transportation costs. The project became an enormous success. Suddenly, politicians and investors everywhere wanted to build canals of their own. Indiana was no exception. State leaders became captivated by a bold vision. They imagined a network of canals, roads, and transportation routes connecting every corner of Indiana. Farmers would ship their products efficiently. Merchants would expand their businesses. New towns would emerge. Wealth would flow into the state. The future seemed bright. In 1836, Indiana launched one of the most ambitious public works programs in American history. The state government approved massive spending for canals, roads, and railroad projects. The scale of the plan was breathtaking. At the time, Indiana had a relatively small population and limited financial resources. Yet, its leaders believed that investment would generate growth and prosperity. Perhaps no project symbolized these ambitions more than the Wabash and Erie Canal. The canal was intended to connect Lake Erie with the Ohio River system, creating a transportation corridor stretching across much of the state. Construction required enormous effort. Workers dug channels through forests, fields, and wetlands. Locks were built to manage changes in elevation. Bridges crossed waterways. Entire communities emerged around construction sites. For many Hoosiers, the canal represented progress itself. The work attracted laborers from various backgrounds. Some were local residents seeking employment. Others were immigrants arriving from Europe. Many Irish immigrants found jobs on canal projects, enduring difficult conditions in exchange for wages that offered a chance at a better future. Construction was physically demanding and often dangerous. Injuries were common. Disease spread easily among workers living in temporary camps. Yet despite these hardships, the canal advanced steadily across the landscape. When completed, portions of the Wabash and Erie Canal transformed transportation. Boats could carry far larger loads than wagons, and do so at lower cost. Farmers gained access to distant markets. Merchants expanded their reach. Towns along the canal experienced economic growth. Warehouses, shops, and businesses appeared. Some communities flourished almost overnight. For a brief period, it seemed as though Indiana's grand vision had succeeded. Yet beneath the optimism lurked a serious problem. The state had borrowed enormous amounts of money to finance these projects. Officials assumed that future economic growth would generate sufficient revenue to repay the debt. This assumption seemed reasonable during prosperous times. Then the economy collapsed. In 1837, a financial crisis known as the Panic of 1837 swept across the United States. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Property values fell. Investment dried up. Suddenly, Indiana found itself carrying massive debts, while economic conditions deteriorated rapidly. The consequences were severe. Construction slowed or stopped on many projects. Some planned improvements were never completed. Taxpayers faced increasing burdens. Political disputes intensified as citizens debated who was responsible for the crisis and how it should be resolved. Indiana's dream of rapid development had become a financial nightmare. For years, the state struggled with debt and uncertainty. Critics accused politicians of reckless spending. Supporters argued that long-term growth justified temporary difficulties. The debates revealed an enduring challenge in American politics. How much should government invest in infrastructure? And who should bear the risks when ambitious projects fail? Eventually, Indiana managed to stabilize its finances, but the experience left a lasting impression on the state's political culture. Yet, history had another surprise in store. Even as canals reached their peak, a revolutionary new technology was emerging: the railroad. At first, railroads seemed almost unbelievable. Steam-powered locomotives could move people and goods faster than horses or canal boats. Early trains were noisy, smoky, and sometimes unreliable, but their potential was obvious. Unlike canals, railroads could operate year-round. They were not limited by frozen waterways or drought conditions. They could cross terrain that would challenge canal engineers. Most importantly, they were fast. During the 1840s and 1850s, railroads spread rapidly across Indiana. Tracks connected towns and cities. New routes linked farmers to markets and manufacturers to customers. Communities that secured railroad connections often prospered. Those bypassed by the tracks sometimes struggled to compete. Entire local economies could rise or fall based on railroad decisions. The impact on daily life was profound. Travel times shrank dramatically. Journeys that once required days could now be completed in hours. Newspapers, mail, and information moved more quickly. Businesses expanded their reach. Indiana became increasingly integrated into the national economy. The railroad age transformed how people thought about distance and opportunity. Ironically, the success of railroads contributed to the decline of canals. Why spend days traveling by canal boat when a train could move the same goods more efficiently? Gradually, canal traffic decreased. Some waterways fell into disrepair. Others remained useful for a time, but could not compete with advancing railroad technology. The very innovation that Indiana's leaders had hoped canals would represent was soon eclipsed by something even more powerful. The state's economy continued evolving. Agriculture remained central, but manufacturing and commerce became increasingly important. Railroads encouraged urban growth and attracted investment. Indianapolis, originally selected as a centrally located capital, benefited enormously from its position within the expanding transportation network. By the middle of the 19th century, it had become a major transportation hub. Trains arrived and departed in every direction, carrying passengers, products, and opportunities. The transformation was remarkable. Only a few decades earlier, Indiana had been a sparsely settled frontier. Now it was becoming a connected and increasingly prosperous state. Farmers sold crops to distant markets. Businesses reached customers across the nation. New technologies accelerated growth. Yet progress brought new challenges as well. Economic inequality increased. Political conflicts continued. Questions about labor, immigration, and development became increasingly important. Above all, another issue was beginning to dominate national debate: slavery. As transportation networks connected Indiana more closely to the rest of the country, the state could not remain isolated from the growing tensions dividing the nation. Indiana had entered the Union as a free state, but it bordered slaveholding Kentucky. Residents followed national events closely. Newspapers carried reports of political disputes. Conversations in homes, businesses, and town squares increasingly turned toward the future of the country itself. The age of canals and railroads had transformed Indiana. It had connected the state to national markets, encouraged growth, and reshaped the landscape. It had also taught hard lessons about ambition, risk, and change. Most importantly, it had prepared Indiana for its next great challenge. A storm was gathering over the United States. Within a few years, the nation would be torn apart by civil war. And when that conflict came, Indiana would play a crucial role in determining the future of America itself. Chapter 9: Indiana and the Civil War. On a cold April morning in 1861, news raced across Indiana with astonishing speed. Telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages, newspapers printed extra editions, crowds gathered in town squares, train stations, and general stores. The United States was at war. Confederate forces had fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and President Abraham Lincoln had called for volunteers to defend the Union. For many Hoosiers, the moment felt both shocking and deeply personal. After all, the president issuing the call to arms was not just the leader of the nation. He was the same Abraham Lincoln who had spent much of his childhood in Indiana's forests. The frontier boy from Pigeon Creek was now leading a divided nation through its greatest crisis. The Civil War would transform the United States forever, but it would also transform Indiana. By 1861, Indiana had changed dramatically from the frontier state that entered the Union in 1816. Railroads connected communities. Farms stretched across much of the countryside. Towns and cities had grown. The population had expanded rapidly. Yet despite this progress, Indiana occupied a complicated position. It was a free state, but it bordered Kentucky, a slave state that remained in the Union. Many Hoosiers had family connections across the Ohio River. Political opinions varied widely. Some residents strongly supported Lincoln and the Union cause. Others criticized the administration and opposed certain war policies. Like much of America, Indiana was divided. Yet, when the war began, one thing became immediately clear. Thousands of Indiana men were willing to fight. The response to Lincoln's call for volunteers was overwhelming. Recruiting stations filled with eager young men. Communities organized rallies and patriotic events. Bands played stirring music. Flags waved from buildings and homes. Men who had never traveled far from their hometowns suddenly prepared to march off to war. Some believed the conflict would end quickly. Few understood how devastating it would become. Indiana ultimately contributed more than 200,000 soldiers to the Union cause. Considering the state's population at the time, this was an extraordinary commitment. Hoosier regiments fought in nearly every major theater of the war. They marched through Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, Virginia, and countless other battlefields. They endured hunger, disease, exhaustion, and combat. For many, the war became the defining experience of their lives. One of the earliest major engagements involving Indiana troops occurred at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee in 1862. The fighting shocked the nation. Casualties reached levels previously unimaginable for most Americans. Soldiers who had expected glory instead encountered chaos, fear, and death. Indiana regiments fought bravely, but they also experienced the harsh realities of modern warfare. Letters sent home described scenes that families struggled to comprehend. Throughout the war, Indiana soldiers earned a reputation for determination and resilience. They fought at Perryville, Stones River, Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, Atlanta, and many other important battles. Some units suffered terrible losses. Entire communities mourned sons, brothers, fathers, and friends who never returned. The war touched nearly every corner of the state. Yet the battlefield story was only part of Indiana's Civil War experience. The home front faced enormous challenges as well. Families struggled while loved ones served far away. Farms lost valuable labor. Businesses adapted to wartime conditions. Women assumed new responsibilities, managing households, farms, and community efforts. They organized aid societies, raised funds, prepared supplies, and cared for wounded soldiers. The war demanded sacrifices from everyone, not just those carrying rifles. Indiana also became a crucial center for logistics and military support. Railroads transported troops and supplies across the state. Factories increased production. Agricultural output helped feed Union armies. Camps and training facilities prepared new recruits for service. The state's location made it strategically important for the Union war effort. Every train carrying soldiers, weapons, food, or equipment demonstrated how interconnected Indiana had become with the broader national struggle. Meanwhile, politics grew increasingly contentious. Although many Hoosiers supported the Union, disagreements emerged regarding how the war should be conducted. Some residents favored aggressive action to defeat the Confederacy. Others worried about government power, military conscription, and economic disruption. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln in 1863, generated particularly strong reactions. Supporters viewed it as a moral and strategic necessity. Critics argued that preserving the Union should remain the primary objective. These debates could become heated, dividing neighbors and communities. Governor Oliver P. Morton emerged as one of the most influential figures in Indiana during the war. A strong supporter of Lincoln and the Union cause, Morton worked tirelessly to mobilize resources and maintain the state's commitment to victory. When political opposition threatened funding for military efforts, Morton found alternative ways to keep support flowing. His leadership earned both admiration and criticism, but there is little doubt that he played a crucial role in Indiana's wartime experience. Tensions occasionally escalated beyond political disagreement. Secret organizations opposed to certain war policies attracted attention from authorities. Rumors of conspiracies circulated. Some feared that Confederate sympathizers might attempt sabotage or insurrection. Although many of these fears proved exaggerated, they reflected the intense anxiety of a nation fighting for its survival. Even in a loyal Union state like Indiana, the war generated uncertainty and suspicion. As the conflict continued, casualties mounted. Disease claimed thousands of lives. In fact, illness killed more soldiers than combat. Camps often suffered from poor sanitation and inadequate medical knowledge. Families waited anxiously for letters, hoping for news from loved ones. Every knock on the door carried the possibility of tragedy. Communities erected monuments and held memorials long before the war ended because loss had become a constant reality. Yet despite the hardships, Union forces gradually gained momentum. Victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in 1863 marked important turning points. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta in 1864. Confederate resources dwindled. The prospect of Union victory became increasingly likely. Indiana soldiers continued fighting through these campaigns, contributing significantly to the eventual outcome. Then, in April 1865, the war finally came to an end. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the conflict. Across Indiana, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in the streets. People embraced one another with relief and joy. The Union had survived. Yet the celebration was short-lived. Only days later came devastating news. President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. For Indiana, the loss carried special significance. The boy who had once split rails and read books by firelight in the forests of southern Indiana was gone. Many Hoosiers felt a deep personal connection to him. Mourning spread throughout the state. The war was over, but its emotional impact remained profound. When the Civil War ended, Indiana was not the same state that had entered it 4 years earlier. More than 24,000 Hoosier soldiers had died. Countless others returned with physical or emotional scars. Families had been changed forever. Yet the conflict also strengthened Indiana's connection to the nation. The state had demonstrated its commitment to the Union and played a significant role in preserving it. The war accelerated economic development, expanded industrial production, and reinforced Indiana's importance within the United States. Most importantly, the Civil War reshaped how Hoosiers saw themselves. They were no longer merely frontier settlers building farms and towns. They had become participants in one of the defining struggles of American history. Their sacrifices helped preserve the nation and end slavery. The forests and frontier communities of earlier generations were giving way to a more modern society. As peace returned, Indiana entered a new era of growth, industry, and transformation. The age of pioneers was fading. The age of factories, cities, and industrial expansion was about to begin. Chapter 10: Factories, Immigrants, and the Gilded Age. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Indiana stood on the edge of a new age. The frontier era that had defined much of the state's early history was fading into memory. The forests that pioneers once struggled to clear had given way to productive farms. Railroads crisscrossed the landscape. Towns had grown into cities. The state had survived the nation's greatest conflict and emerged more connected to the American economy than ever before. Yet what came next would transform Indiana even more dramatically than statehood, canals, or railroads. A powerful force was reshaping not only Indiana, but the entire United States. That force was industrialization. In the decades after the Civil War, factories began appearing across Indiana. Smokestacks rose above city skylines. Machines hummed day and night. Rail yards bustled with activity. New industries emerged with astonishing speed. For many people, it felt as though the future had suddenly arrived. The period became known as the Gilded Age, a term that suggested something covered in a thin layer of gold. On the surface, America appeared prosperous and successful. Beneath that shiny exterior, however, many problems remained hidden. Indiana would experience both sides of this transformation. The opportunities were enormous. So were the challenges. Cities became the engines of change. Indianapolis grew rapidly as railroads connected it to markets across the nation. Other communities such as Fort Wayne, South Bend, Terre Haute, Evansville, and Gary would eventually become important centers of industry and commerce. Businesses expanded. Factories multiplied. New jobs attracted workers from both rural areas and distant countries. For the first time in Indiana history, large numbers of people earned their living not on farms, but in factories and workshops. The products manufactured in Indiana reached customers across the nation. Factories produced glass, furniture, farm equipment, machinery, steel products, textiles, and countless other goods. Every year seemed to bring new inventions and technologies. Electric lights began replacing candles and oil lamps. Telephones connected people across long distances. Improved transportation reduced travel times. What had once seemed impossible became ordinary. To many Hoosiers, the future looked brighter than ever. One reason for this growth was Indiana's location. Situated in the heart of the Midwest, the state enjoyed access to major transportation networks. Railroads connected Indiana to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and other important markets. Raw materials could be imported efficiently, and finished products could be shipped nationwide. Geography, which had once challenged pioneers, now became an economic advantage. Industrial growth required workers, and workers arrived in large numbers. Immigrants from Europe came seeking opportunities unavailable in their homelands. Germans, Irish, Italians, Poles, and many others settled in Indiana communities. Some found jobs in factories, others opened businesses, worked in construction, or established farms. They brought languages, traditions, foods, religions, and customs that enriched Indiana's cultural landscape. Entire neighborhoods reflected the heritage of immigrant communities. Churches, schools, social clubs, and cultural organizations helped preserve traditions while also helping newcomers adapt to American life. The immigrant experience was rarely easy. Many arrived with little money and limited knowledge of English. They often accepted difficult jobs that native-born workers avoided. Housing conditions in growing cities could be crowded and unhealthy. Discrimination was common. Yet despite these obstacles, countless immigrants persevered. Their labor helped build the industries and infrastructure that fueled Indiana's growth. Their children and grandchildren would become an important part of the state's identity. Industrialization also created extraordinary wealth. Business owners who successfully navigated the changing economy sometimes accumulated fortunes that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Grand homes appeared in prosperous neighborhoods. Wealthy families sponsored civic projects, libraries, museums, and educational institutions. Some genuinely sought to improve society through philanthropy and public service. Yet not everyone benefited equally from economic growth. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically during the Gilded Age. While some individuals amassed fortunes, many workers struggled to make ends meet. Factory jobs could be dangerous. Long hours were common. Workplace safety standards were often minimal. Injuries occurred frequently. Children sometimes worked alongside adults in difficult conditions. Laborers who complained risked losing their jobs. Industrialization generated wealth, but it also created new forms of hardship. These tensions contributed to the rise of organized labor. Workers began forming unions to advocate for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Employers often resisted these efforts. Labor disputes became increasingly common throughout the United States, including Indiana. Strikes occasionally shut down factories and railroads. Confrontations between workers and employers sometimes turned violent. Both sides believed they were defending their interests and their vision of fairness. The resulting conflicts became one of the defining features of the Gilded Age. Farmers also faced challenges. Although industrialization brought prosperity to some sectors of the economy, many agricultural families struggled with falling crop prices, debt, and fluctuating markets. Railroads, while essential for transportation, sometimes charged rates that farmers considered unfair. Economic pressures fueled political movements seeking reform and greater government oversight. The tensions between urban and rural interests became increasingly visible throughout Indiana and the nation. Political corruption also emerged as a significant issue during this era. Rapid growth created opportunities for dishonest practices. Some business leaders sought special favors from politicians. Certain public officials used their positions for personal gain. While many individuals acted honorably, scandals and accusations of corruption undermined public trust. Citizens debated how much influence wealthy corporations should have over government decisions. These debates remain familiar even today. Technological innovation continued transforming daily life. Factories increased production at unprecedented rates. Railroads expanded farther each year. New inventions improved communication, transportation, and manufacturing. People who had grown up in a world of horse-drawn wagons suddenly found themselves living in an age of telephones, electric lights, and industrial machinery. The pace of change could be exhilarating, but it could also be unsettling. Many Americans wondered whether traditional values and community ties could survive in such a rapidly changing society. Indiana's cities reflected these contradictions. They offered opportunity and excitement, but also poverty and overcrowding. Wealth and hardship often existed side by side. A businessman might live in a luxurious home while factory workers crowded into modest housing nearby. The benefits of industrial growth were real, but they were not shared equally. Throughout the Gilded Age, Indiana became increasingly diverse and interconnected. Immigration enriched communities. Industry fueled economic expansion. Railroads linked cities and markets. Educational institutions grew. Civic organizations flourished. The state was no longer a frontier society. It was becoming a modern industrial economy. Yet beneath the progress, social tensions continued to simmer. Questions about labor rights, economic fairness, political power, immigration, and social change remained unresolved. Many Hoosiers worried about the future. Others embraced change with enthusiasm. The debates reflected a society struggling to adapt to extraordinary transformation. By the end of the 19th century, Indiana had undergone a remarkable evolution. Within a few generations, it had progressed from wilderness frontier to industrial state. Farms still covered much of the landscape, but factories and cities increasingly shaped the economy. New opportunities emerged, but so did new challenges. The Gilded Age had brought prosperity, innovation, and growth. Yet it had also exposed deep divisions and inequalities. As the 20th century approached, these tensions would not disappear. In fact, some would become even more intense. New social movements, political battles, and cultural conflicts awaited Indiana. Among the most surprising developments would be the rise of a powerful organization that would leave a dark mark on the state's history. The next chapter would reveal how fear, prejudice, and social anxiety helped fuel one of the most controversial periods Indiana had ever experienced. Chapter 11. The Klan and Social Conflict. By the early 20th century, Indiana seemed to embody the American success story. The frontier was gone. Railroads connected cities and towns. Factories produced goods for national markets. Immigrants had helped build thriving communities. New technologies transformed daily life. Automobiles appeared on roads that would have amazed earlier generations. Electric lights illuminated homes and businesses. The economy grew. Cities expanded. To many observers, Indiana appeared to be marching confidently into the future. Yet beneath the surface of this progress lay deep anxieties and tensions. Rapid change often creates uncertainty, and the decades following the First World War proved no exception. As Americans adjusted to a new century, many worried that the country they knew was changing too quickly. Those fears would help fuel one of the darkest and most controversial chapters in Indiana history. Surprisingly, the story begins not in a hidden meeting hall or a remote countryside gathering, but in the heart of mainstream society. During the 1920s, Indiana became one of the strongest centers of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. To modern audiences, this fact often comes as a shock. Many people associate the Klan primarily with the American South. Yet during this period, Indiana became one of its most powerful strongholds. Understanding how this happened requires understanding the fears and frustrations that shaped the era. The United States emerged from the First World War transformed. Millions of soldiers returned home. Immigration had changed the demographic makeup of many communities. Cities were growing rapidly. New forms of entertainment, such as movies and radio, influenced popular culture. Women gained the right to vote. Social norms evolved. For some Americans, these developments represented exciting progress. For others, they created uncertainty and fear. Many people worried that traditional values were disappearing. The Ku Klux Klan exploited these anxieties. The organization that emerged during the 1920s differed in some ways from the original Klan of the Reconstruction era. While racism remained central to its ideology, the movement also targeted Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and anyone it considered insufficiently American. It promoted a vision of society based on white Protestant dominance and claimed to defend morality, patriotism, and traditional values. Its leaders presented the organization as a respectable civic movement rather than a hate group. This strategy helped attract members from across society. Business owners joined, politicians joined, ministers joined, teachers joined, farmers joined. The Klan's influence spread rapidly throughout Indiana. At its peak, historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of Hoosiers became members. In some communities, joining the organization seemed almost fashionable. Public marches drew large crowds. Meetings were held openly. Candidates supported by the Klan won elections. The movement gained influence over local governments, law enforcement, and political institutions. For a time, it appeared unstoppable. At the center of this rise stood a man named D.C. Stevenson. An extraordinarily effective organizer, Stevenson transformed Indiana into a Klan powerhouse. Charismatic, ambitious, and ruthless, he built a political machine that extended throughout the state. He boasted openly about his power. According to one famous statement, he claimed, "I am the law in Indiana." Whether entirely true or not, the comment reflected the extraordinary influence he had accumulated. Politicians sought his endorsement. Office holders feared his opposition. The organization seemed deeply embedded in Indiana's political life. Yet the Klan's success revealed troubling realities about the society it appealed to. Many members were not violent extremists in the conventional sense. Instead, they were ordinary citizens responding to fears about social change. This fact makes the story more unsettling, not less. The movement thrived because it convinced large numbers of otherwise respectable people that intolerance, exclusion, and prejudice were acceptable responses to uncertainty. The Klan promised simple answers to complex problems. It offered clear villains and easy explanations. Throughout history, such movements have often found audiences during periods of rapid change. The consequences were painful for those targeted by the organization. Catholic communities faced discrimination and intimidation. Jewish residents encountered hostility. Immigrant families were treated with suspicion. African Americans experienced racism reinforced by an organization claiming enormous social and political influence. Many Hoosiers found themselves excluded, not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. Yet even at the height of the Klan's power, resistance existed. Journalists investigated corruption. Religious leaders challenged intolerance. Civic organizations promoted alternative visions of community and citizenship. Not everyone accepted the Klan's message. Beneath the appearance of strength, cracks were beginning to emerge. Then came the scandal that changed everything. In 1925, D.C. Stevenson was accused of abducting and sexually assaulting a young woman named Madge Oberholzer. The details shocked the state. The victim later died from injuries and poisoning associated with the attack. Stevenson was arrested, tried, and convicted. The case dominated headlines. For many Hoosiers, the scandal shattered the carefully cultivated image of moral leadership that the Klan had projected. Suddenly, the organization's most powerful leader stood exposed as a criminal. The damage extended far beyond Stevenson himself. Furious that political allies refused to rescue him, Stevenson began revealing details about corruption within Indiana politics. His disclosures implicated numerous public officials and exposed the extent of the Klan's influence over government. The revelations created a political earthquake. Citizens who had trusted the organization felt betrayed. Support rapidly eroded. Membership declined. Politicians distanced themselves from the movement. The collapse was remarkably swift. Within just a few years, the Klan's dominance in Indiana largely disintegrated. Yet the story does not end with Stevenson's conviction. The broader lesson is more important than the downfall of a single man. Indiana's experience during the 1920s demonstrated how vulnerable societies can become when fear, prejudice, and uncertainty are exploited for political gain. It also demonstrated something more hopeful. Citizens, journalists, courts, and civic institutions ultimately pushed back. Corruption was exposed. Extremism lost credibility. Public opinion shifted. The same democratic system that allowed the Klan to gain influence also contained mechanisms capable of challenging and dismantling that influence. For Indiana, the episode left a complicated legacy. It remains one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the state's history. Yet, confronting difficult history is essential for understanding the past honestly. The goal is not to hide mistakes, but to learn from them. Indiana's experience reminds us that progress is never guaranteed. Economic growth, technological innovation, and material prosperity do not automatically eliminate prejudice or social conflict. In fact, periods of rapid change sometimes intensify those tensions. At the same time, the story offers an important lesson about resilience. The Klan's rise was dramatic, but its fall was equally significant. Many Hoosiers rejected the movement once its true nature became clear. Communities moved forward. New generations built a more inclusive society. The state did not become defined solely by one dark period. Instead, it learned from it. As the 1920s drew to a close, another challenge was already approaching. The economic prosperity that had characterized much of the decade would soon collapse. Factories would slow, banks would fail, unemployment would soar. The Great Depression was about to arrive, bringing hardships unlike anything most Americans had ever experienced. Indiana had confronted social conflict and political scandal. Now it would face an economic catastrophe that would test the strength of its people in entirely new ways. The next chapter in Indiana's story would reveal how the state endured one of the most difficult periods in American history. and emerged transformed once again. Chapter 12. Hard Times and World War. In October 1929, the American economy seemed unstoppable. Factories hummed with activity, businesses expanded, investors poured money into the stock market. Many people believed prosperity would continue forever. In Indiana, as across much of the United States, optimism filled the air. Yet beneath the surface, serious problems had been building for years. Too much speculation, too much debt, and too much confidence had created a fragile system. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. The stock market crashed. Panic spread. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Millions of Americans suddenly found themselves facing a future they had never imagined. The Great Depression had begun. For Indiana families, the impact was devastating. During the prosperous years of the 1920s, many Hoosiers had believed that economic progress would continue indefinitely. Instead, they watched jobs disappear and savings evaporate. Factories reduced production or shut down entirely. Construction projects stopped. Businesses closed their doors. Workers who had once supported their families suddenly found themselves unemployed. Every community felt the effects. In industrial cities, factory workers searched desperately for jobs that no longer existed. In small towns, merchants struggled as customers stopped spending money. Even farmers suffered. Although agriculture had faced challenges before the crash, the Depression made conditions even worse. Crop prices fell dramatically. Families who worked tirelessly to grow food often discovered they could not earn enough money to survive. Across Indiana, uncertainty became part of daily life. Imagine waking up each morning not knowing whether you could pay your bills, feed your family, or keep your home. That was the reality for countless Hoosiers during the early 1930s. Long lines formed outside soup kitchens. Charitable organizations worked tirelessly to help those in need. Neighbors often relied on one another. Communities shared food, clothing, and resources whenever possible. For many families, survival depended not on government programs, but on personal relationships and local support networks. Yet despite the hardship, people found ways to endure. They repaired old clothes instead of buying new ones. They grew gardens to supplement their food supply. They reused and recycled nearly everything. Children who grew up during the Depression often carried lessons about thrift and resourcefulness for the rest of their lives. Hardship became a teacher, even if it was a cruel one. As conditions worsened, many Americans looked to government for help. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president and launched a series of programs known as the New Deal. These initiatives aimed to provide relief, create jobs, and stimulate economic recovery. Indiana participated in many of these efforts. Public works projects employed workers to build roads, bridges, schools, parks, and other infrastructure. Conservation programs improved natural areas. Construction projects modernized communities. While the New Deal did not end the Depression immediately, it provided assistance to many struggling families and left a lasting mark on the state's landscape. Throughout the 1930s, Indiana slowly began recovering. Factories reopened. Employment improved somewhat. Yet the recovery remained fragile. Then, events unfolding thousands of miles away would change everything. Across Europe and Asia, aggressive governments were expanding their power. Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany pursued conquest and domination. Imperial Japan expanded throughout Asia. International tensions grew year after year. Many Americans hoped to avoid involvement in another global conflict. The memory of the First World War remained fresh and painful, yet events were moving toward confrontation. On December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. News spread rapidly across Indiana. Radios interrupted regular programming. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Citizens gathered to hear updates. The attack shocked the nation. Suddenly, the United States was at war. For many Hoosiers, the moment felt similar to the beginning of the Civil War 80 years earlier. Young men volunteered for military service. Communities organized support efforts. Factories prepared for a new mission. Once again, Indiana would play a vital role in a national struggle. The transformation was extraordinary. During the Depression, factories had struggled to find customers. Now they faced overwhelming demand. Industrial production shifted rapidly toward military needs. Factories that once produced civilian goods began manufacturing weapons, vehicles, ammunition, engines, and equipment. Assembly lines operated around the clock. New facilities appeared. Existing plants expanded. The state became an important contributor to the American war effort. The economic impact was dramatic. Unemployment fell sharply as factories hired workers to meet wartime demand. Men and women found jobs in industries that had barely existed a few years earlier. For many families, the war brought economic opportunities unavailable during the Depression. Yet these opportunities came with enormous sacrifices. Thousands of Indiana men entered military service. They fought in Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, and countless other locations around the globe. Some served aboard ships. Others flew aircraft. Many fought as infantry soldiers in some of the most intense battles of the war. Hoosiers participated in campaigns from Normandy to Okinawa, from the Battle of the Bulge to the islands of the Pacific. The distances involved were staggering. Young men who had rarely traveled beyond Indiana suddenly found themselves on distant continents fighting a global conflict. Back home, life changed as well. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Many took jobs in factories and industries traditionally dominated by men. Their contributions proved essential to wartime production. The image of women helping build planes, vehicles, and equipment became one of the defining symbols of the era. Indiana women played a critical role in ensuring that American forces received the supplies they needed. Wartime also brought rationing. Certain goods became scarce as resources were directed toward the military. Families conserved the fuel, food, rubber, and metal. Citizens purchased war bonds to help finance the conflict. School children collected scrap materials. Communities organized patriotic events. The war effort touched nearly every aspect of daily life. Everyone was expected to contribute. News from the front lines became a constant presence. Families anxiously awaited letters from loved ones overseas. Newspapers published casualty lists. Every telegram delivered to a home carried the possibility of heartbreaking news. Communities celebrated victories, but also mourned losses. The war united many Americans, yet it reminded them daily of the human cost of conflict. Gradually, the tide began to turn. American forces and their allies achieved important victories. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Japan continued fighting until August, when the war finally ended following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After nearly 4 years of conflict, peace had returned. Across Indiana, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang, crowds filled the streets, families welcomed loved ones home. The relief was immense. Yet the end of the war marked not a return to the old world, but the beginning of a new one. Indiana emerged from World War II transformed. The depression that had dominated the 1930s was gone. Factories remained productive. New industries expanded. Veterans returned with new experiences and ambitions. Educational opportunities increased through programs that helped former service members attend college. Home construction accelerated. Communities grew. Economic prosperity returned on a scale few could have imagined during the darkest years of the Depression. The war had demanded enormous sacrifices, but it had also reshaped Indiana's economy and society. The state entered the post-war era more industrialized, more connected, and more influential than ever before. Yet peace brought new challenges as well. A rapidly changing economy, expanding suburbs, technological innovation, and cultural shifts would redefine Indiana once again. The frontier generation was long gone. The industrial age had matured. Now, a modern America was emerging, and Indiana stood ready to help shape it. The hardships of the Depression and the sacrifices of World War II had forged a stronger and more confident state, prepared to enter one of the most prosperous periods in its history. Chapter 13. Racing, Basketball, and Hoosier Pride. If you ask people across the United States what Indiana is famous for, many will mention cornfields, small towns, or the Indianapolis 500. Others will immediately think of basketball. What makes Indiana unique is not simply that people enjoy sports. Every state enjoys sports. What makes Indiana different is the way sports became woven into the state's identity. In Indiana, sports are more than entertainment. They are community gatherings, family traditions, local legends, and shared memories passed from one generation to the next. To understand modern Indiana, you must understand the state's deep love affair with competition, speed, teamwork, and hometown pride. Few places in America have built a cultural identity around sports as completely as Indiana has. The story begins with a simple but powerful idea. Sports create community. Throughout Indiana's history, people often lived in small towns separated by farmland, forests, and long distances. Communities developed strong local identities. Residents took pride in their schools, businesses, churches, and neighborhoods. Sports provided a way for these communities to come together. Victories became shared celebrations. Defeats became collective disappointments. Entire towns invested emotionally in the success of local teams and athletes. Over time, sports became part of what it meant to be a Hoosier. Perhaps no event symbolizes Indiana more than the Indianapolis 500. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people gather at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to witness one of the most famous automobile races in the world. Yet the story of the race begins long before roaring engines and checkered flags. At the start of the 20th century, the automobile was still a relatively new invention. Cars fascinated the public, but many people questioned their reliability. Manufacturers needed a way to test vehicles and demonstrate their capabilities. In 1909, a group of entrepreneurs built a massive racing facility on the outskirts of Indianapolis. The track quickly became known as the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. At the time, few could have imagined how famous it would become. The first Indianapolis 500 was held in 1911. The concept was simple but ambitious. Drivers would compete over a grueling 500-mile distance. The race tested not only speed, but also endurance, strategy, and engineering. Crowds were captivated. Newspapers covered the event extensively. The race quickly became one of the premier sporting spectacles in America. Over the decades, legends emerged. Famous drivers risked everything in pursuit of victory. Engineers pushed technology to new limits. Dramatic crashes, thrilling finishes, and unforgettable moments became part of racing history. For many Hoosiers, race day evolved into something almost sacred. Families planned entire weekends around the event. Traditions developed. Generations attended together. The Indianapolis 500 became far more than a race. It became a symbol of Indiana itself. Yet, if the Indianapolis 500 represents speed, basketball represents the soul of Indiana. To outsiders, Indiana's passion for basketball can seem almost impossible to understand. Why would a state become so devoted to a game invented in Massachusetts? The answer lies partly in geography and community. Basketball required relatively little equipment. A simple gymnasium could host games throughout the winter months. Small towns that lacked professional sports teams could still compete against neighboring communities. The game spread rapidly through Indiana schools during the early 20th century. Soon, it became a statewide obsession. Friday night basketball games evolved into major social events. Entire towns packed gymnasiums to cheer for local teams. Businesses adjusted schedules. Families arranged plans around game nights. Victories became community celebrations. Rivalries developed between neighboring towns and schools. The emotional investment was enormous. Unlike professional sports, high school basketball felt personal. The players were local students. The coaches were community members. Everyone knew someone on the team. Success belonged to the entire town. One reason Indiana basketball became legendary was the state's single-class tournament system. For many decades, schools of all sizes competed against one another for a single state championship. Tiny rural schools could face large urban schools. Every team had a chance to dream. This format created some of the most memorable stories in sports history. Underdogs occasionally defeated heavily favored opponents. Entire communities rallied behind teams that seemed to have no chance of success. These stories captured the imagination of the public and reinforced the belief that determination and teamwork could overcome almost any obstacle. Perhaps the most famous example occurred in 1954, when tiny Milan High School won the Indiana State Championship, despite having a student body far smaller than most competitors. The story became national legend and later inspired the movie Hoosiers, one of the most beloved sports films ever made. Although the movie took creative liberties, it captured something real about Indiana culture. The idea that a small town team could achieve greatness resonated deeply with people across the state. Basketball's success was not limited to high schools. Indiana also became home to some of the most respected college basketball programs in the country. Universities such as Indiana University, Purdue University, and the University of Notre Dame developed passionate fan bases and rich traditions. College games attracted enormous attention. Coaches became celebrities. Players became local heroes. Success on the court brought pride to entire regions of the state. Few figures embodied Indiana basketball more than Bob Knight. As coach of Indiana University, Knight built one of the most successful programs in college basketball history. His teams won national championships and earned widespread recognition. Though often controversial, Knight became one of the most influential figures in the sport. His legacy remains deeply connected to Indiana basketball culture. Professional basketball also found a home in Indiana. The Indiana Pacers became one of the state's most recognizable sports franchises. Their success in both the American Basketball Association and later the National Basketball Association helped strengthen Indiana's reputation as a basketball state. Games attracted passionate crowds, and players became household names. Yet even with professional success, many Hoosiers continued to view high school basketball as the purest expression of the sport. Sports also reflected broader changes occurring within Indiana society. Growing cities supported larger venues and professional organizations. Advances in transportation allowed teams to travel more easily. Radio and television brought games into homes across the state. What once required attending an event in person could now be experienced from hundreds of miles away. Media coverage turned local athletes into statewide celebrities. Sports became a common language connecting diverse communities. The influence extended beyond basketball and racing. Indiana produced successful athletes in football, baseball, swimming, track and field, and many other sports. Yet basketball and the Indianapolis 500 remained uniquely tied to the state's identity. They represented two different aspects of Indiana culture. Racing celebrated innovation, engineering, speed, and spectacle. Basketball celebrated community, teamwork, perseverance, and local pride. Together, they created a powerful cultural tradition unlike anything found elsewhere in America. By the late 20th century, Indiana's reputation as a sports state was firmly established. Visitors traveled from around the world to attend the Indianapolis 500. Basketball fans filled gymnasiums and arenas. Sports stories became part of family histories. Grandparents shared memories of famous games and races. Parents introduced children to beloved traditions. Communities continued gathering around local teams just as they had for generations. In many ways, sports helped Indiana maintain a sense of identity during periods of rapid social and economic change. Factories opened and closed. Technologies evolved. Populations shifted. Yet the excitement of race day and the energy of basketball season remained constant. These traditions reminded Hoosiers of who they were and where they came from. They created connections across generations and communities. They fostered pride in a state that often preferred hard work and quiet determination over national attention. Through sports, Indiana found a way to express its values and celebrate its people. As the 20th century continued, however, new challenges would emerge. Globalization, economic change, and shifting industries would reshape the state's economy and society once again. Indiana's future would depend not only on tradition, but also on innovation and adaptation. The next chapter would explore how Indiana navigated these changes and entered the modern era while holding on to the spirit that had defined it for generations. Chapter 14. Modern Indiana. Industry, Innovation, and Change. When World War II ended in 1945, Indiana stood at the threshold of one of the most prosperous periods in its history. The factories that had powered the American war effort remained active. Millions of returning veterans were ready to build families, start businesses, and create new communities. The economy surged. New homes appeared across the landscape. Highways expanded. Schools grew. Factories hired workers at an unprecedented pace. For many Hoosiers, it felt as though the future had finally arrived. Yet the story of modern Indiana is not simply a story of prosperity. It is also a story of adaptation. Over the next several decades, the state would experience extraordinary growth. Painful economic disruption, technological transformation, and a constant struggle to reinvent itself in a rapidly changing world. The decades following the war are often remembered as a golden age of American manufacturing. Indiana was perfectly positioned to benefit. Its central location, extensive transportation networks, skilled workforce, and industrial tradition made it a major manufacturing center. Factories produced automobiles, steel, machinery, pharmaceuticals, appliances, and countless other products. Communities throughout the state depended on manufacturing jobs. For many workers, a factory position offered something previous generations could scarcely imagine: stable employment, good wages, benefits, the opportunity to buy a home, raise a family, and enjoy a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. Entire towns were built around major employers. In places such as Gary, South Bend, Kokomo, Fort Wayne, and Anderson, factories became more than workplaces. They became the foundation of community life. Local businesses depended on factory workers. Schools benefited from tax revenue. Sports teams received sponsorships. Civic organizations thrived. When the factories prospered, the towns prospered. Manufacturing shaped not only Indiana's economy, but also its identity. During the 1950s and 1960s, optimism seemed limitless. New highways connected cities and suburbs. The interstate highway system transformed transportation across the country, and Indiana's central location made it an important transportation hub. Families purchased automobiles in record numbers. Shopping centers appeared. Television entered homes. College attendance increased. Technological innovation improved daily life. For many Americans, including many Hoosiers, the post-war years represented a period of extraordinary confidence. Yet, even during these prosperous decades, changes were quietly taking shape beneath the surface. Technology was evolving. Global competition was increasing. Economic patterns were shifting. These developments would eventually challenge the industrial model that had brought so much success. The first signs appeared gradually. Automation allowed factories to produce more goods with fewer workers. Machines performed tasks that once required large numbers of employees. Productivity increased, but employment growth slowed. At first, few people worried. New industries continued creating jobs. The economy remained strong. Most assumed manufacturing would always dominate Indiana's future. Then came globalization. During the second half of the 20th century, international trade expanded dramatically. Companies increasingly competed with businesses around the world. Products could be manufactured in countries with lower labor costs and shipped across oceans. Markets became global rather than local or national. For consumers, this often meant lower prices. For many manufacturing communities, however, it created enormous challenges. Factories that had once seemed permanent began closing or downsizing. Jobs disappeared. Communities that had depended on a single industry suddenly faced uncertainty. The impact could be devastating. Imagine a town where generations of families worked at the same factory. Grandparents worked there, parents worked there, children expected to work there. Then one day the factory closes. Hundreds or even thousands of jobs vanish. Local businesses lose customers. Tax revenues decline. Families move away, searching for opportunities elsewhere. Schools face enrollment declines. Entire communities must redefine themselves. This scenario played out in parts of Indiana during the late 20th century. The decline of manufacturing did not affect every area equally, but its influence was widespread. Some cities struggled more than others. South Bend, for example, experienced major economic disruption when automobile-related manufacturing declined. Other communities faced similar challenges as traditional industries evolved or disappeared. The emotional impact was often as significant as the economic impact. Manufacturing had been central to local identity. Losing those jobs felt like losing part of the community itself. Yet, Indiana's story is not one of decline. It is a story of adaptation. Again and again, the state sought new ways to compete and grow. Businesses invested in advanced manufacturing technologies. Universities expanded research programs. Entrepreneurs launched new ventures. Communities pursued economic diversification rather than relying on a single industry. The process was not always easy, but it demonstrated a characteristic that had defined Indiana since the frontier era: resilience. One area of growth involved advanced manufacturing. While traditional factory jobs declined in some sectors, modern facilities increasingly relied on automation, robotics, and highly skilled workers. Indiana remained one of the leading manufacturing states in America, but the nature of manufacturing changed. Workers needed new skills. Education and technical training became increasingly important. The factory of the 21st century looked very different from the factory of the 1950s. Healthcare also emerged as a major economic force. Hospitals, research institutions, pharmaceutical companies, and medical technology firms expanded across the state. Indianapolis became a center for life sciences and medical innovation. Companies developed products that reached global markets. Scientific research generated new opportunities. Knowledge and innovation increasingly joined manufacturing as pillars of the state's economy. Higher education played a crucial role in this transformation. Institutions such as Indiana University, Purdue University, and the University of Notre Dame expanded their influence. Universities became engines of research, entrepreneurship, and workforce development. Students from around the world came to Indiana to study. Graduates contributed to industries ranging from engineering and medicine to technology and business. Technology itself reshaped daily life. Computers entered homes and workplaces. The internet revolutionized communication and commerce. Businesses adapted to digital tools and global networks. Farmers adopted sophisticated technologies that improved productivity. Logistics companies used advanced systems to move goods efficiently across the country. The pace of change accelerated year after year. Demographic changes also influenced modern Indiana. Cities continued evolving. Suburban growth reshaped population patterns. Immigration brought new communities and cultural influences. Diverse traditions enriched local culture. New restaurants, festivals, businesses, and organizations reflected a changing population. Indiana remained deeply rooted in its history, yet it continued becoming more connected to the wider world. Throughout these transformations, certain aspects of Indiana remained remarkably consistent. Agriculture continued playing a major role in the economy. Manufacturing remained important even as it evolved. Communities retained strong local identities. Sports, education, and civic involvement continued shaping daily life. The state balanced tradition and innovation, often embracing change while maintaining connections to its past. Challenges certainly remained. Economic inequality, workforce transitions, infrastructure needs, and political debates continued influencing public life. Like every state, Indiana faced difficult questions about its future. How should communities adapt to technological change? How could economic growth be shared more broadly? What industries would define the next generation? These questions had no simple answers. Yet Indiana's history offered reasons for optimism. Time and again, the state had confronted major disruptions and found ways to move forward. From frontier settlement to industrialization, from economic depression to global war, from manufacturing dominance to technological transformation, each era brought new obstacles and new opportunities. By the beginning of the 21st century, Indiana stood as a state shaped by both continuity and change. Its economy was more diverse than ever. Its people were connected to national and global networks. Its communities balanced historical traditions with modern innovation. The story of modern Indiana was still being written. Yet one thing remained clear. The qualities that helped pioneers survive the frontier and helped workers endure economic upheaval continue to define the state. Adaptability, determination, practical problem solving, a willingness to confront challenges rather than surrender to them. These qualities would guide Indiana into the future, just as they had guided it through every chapter of its past. And that future would become the subject of our final chapter, where we explore the Indiana of today and ask what it truly means to be a Hoosier in the 21st century. Chapter 15. The Indiana of Today. If someone from the Indiana frontier of 1816 could suddenly step into the state of today, they would hardly recognize it. The forests that once seemed endless have given way to cities, highways, suburbs, farms, factories, research laboratories, universities, and sports arenas. The rivers that carried canoes and flatboats now flow beside interstate bridges and modern transportation networks. Millions of people live where only scattered settlements once existed. Yet despite all these changes, certain threads connect modern Indiana to every chapter of its past. The story of Indiana today is not merely about what has changed. It is also about what has endured. To understand the Indiana of the 21st century, we must ask a simple but fascinating question. What does it mean to be a Hoosier today? The answer is more complex than many outsiders realize. Indiana is often described as a Midwestern state, and that description is certainly true. Yet Indiana occupies a unique position within the United States. It sits at a crossroads of regions, cultures, and economies. To the north lies the influence of the Great Lakes. To the south, echoes of the Ohio River Valley and the American South remain visible. To the west stretch the agricultural landscapes of the Midwest. To the east lie connections to the industrial centers of neighboring states. Indiana has always been shaped by movement, exchange, and adaptation. That continues today. Modern Indiana is home to more than 6 million people. The majority live in metropolitan areas centered around cities such as Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, Evansville, South Bend, and Bloomington. Indianapolis remains the heart of the state. What began as a planned capital surrounded by wilderness has become one of the largest cities in the Midwest. Its skyline reflects Indiana's transformation from frontier territory to modern economic center. Yet even as urban areas grow, much of Indiana remains deeply connected to rural life. Agriculture continues to play a vital role in the state's identity and economy. Drive through Indiana and you will quickly understand why. Vast fields of corn and soybeans stretch across the landscape. Family farms and large agricultural operations alike contribute to one of the most productive farming regions in the world. Indiana consistently ranks among the leading agricultural states in the nation. Modern farmers use technology that would seem like science fiction to earlier generations. Satellites, computers, drones, and precision equipment help maximize productivity. Yet beneath the technological sophistication lies a tradition stretching back to the earliest settlers who cleared fields from the wilderness. Agriculture remains one of the strongest links between Indiana's past and present. The economy of modern Indiana is remarkably diverse. Manufacturing remains important despite decades of change. In fact, Indiana continues to be one of the leading manufacturing states in America. Advanced factories produce automobiles, engines, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, aerospace components, and industrial equipment. Modern manufacturing facilities often rely on robotics, automation, and highly skilled workers rather than the labor-intensive methods of earlier eras. The factories remain, but the nature of factory work has evolved dramatically. Healthcare and life sciences have become increasingly significant as well. Indianapolis has emerged as an important center for pharmaceutical research and medical innovation. Companies, hospitals, and research institutions contribute billions of dollars to the economy while helping develop treatments and technologies that impact lives around the world. What once was a state known primarily for farming and manufacturing now participates in some of the most advanced scientific fields imaginable. Education plays a central role in this transformation. Universities have become among Indiana's most important institutions. Indiana University is recognized for its strengths in medicine, business, and research. Purdue University has earned international respect for engineering, aviation, and technology. University of Notre Dame is known worldwide for academic excellence and athletic tradition. Together with many other colleges and universities, these institutions help educate future generations while attracting students, researchers, and investment from across the globe. Culture in modern Indiana reflects a blend of tradition and innovation. The state's sporting traditions remain as strong as ever. The Indianapolis 500 continues drawing hundreds of thousands of spectators every year. Basketball remains deeply embedded in community life. Friday night high school games still fill gymnasiums across the state. Professional sports teams attract passionate supporters. Yet Indiana's cultural identity extends beyond sports. Museums, theaters, music festivals, art galleries, and cultural organizations contribute to a vibrant and diverse cultural landscape. Communities celebrate traditions brought by generations of immigrants while also embracing new influences from around the world. Politically, Indiana often attracts national attention. The state is generally regarded as conservative, particularly in statewide elections, though political views vary significantly across different regions and communities. Urban areas, suburban communities, and rural counties often approach issues from different perspectives. As in much of America, debates over economic policy, education, healthcare, public safety, and social issues remain active and sometimes contentious. Indiana's political landscape reflects both its Midwestern character and the broader national conversations shaping American society. Like every state, Indiana faces challenges. Population growth is uneven, with some communities expanding rapidly, while others struggle with decline. Economic transitions continue affecting regions historically dependent on manufacturing. Workforce development remains a priority as technology changes the nature of employment. Infrastructure requires ongoing investment. Healthcare access, educational outcomes, and housing affordability remain important concerns. Environmental issues, including water quality and land use, generate increasing attention. None of these challenges are unique to Indiana, but each influences the state's future. At the same time, opportunities abound. Indiana's central location remains one of its greatest advantages. Major transportation routes connect the state to national and international markets. Universities continue generating research and innovation. New industries emerge. Entrepreneurs launch businesses. Communities invest in revitalization and development projects. The state that once adapted to canals, railroads, industrialization, globalization, and technological change continues adapting today. This ability to evolve may be Indiana's greatest strength. So what does it mean to be a Hoosier in the 21st century? The answer varies from person to person, yet certain themes appear repeatedly throughout the state's history. Hard work, practicality, community, resilience, a willingness to adapt while maintaining strong connections to tradition. These qualities helped Native peoples thrive in the Ohio Valley. They helped pioneers survive the frontier. They helped workers build factories and industries. They helped communities endure economic hardship and war. They continue shaping Indiana today. Modern Hoosiers live in a world very different from that of their ancestors. Yet they inherit a legacy stretching back thousands of years. They drive on roads that follow ancient pathways. They live in communities built upon generations of effort and sacrifice. They participate in traditions that connect past and present. Whether attending the Indianapolis 500, cheering at a basketball game, working in a laboratory, teaching in a classroom, managing a farm, operating a business, or raising a family, they contribute to a story still being written. And that may be the most important lesson of Indiana's history. The story is never truly finished. Every generation inherits a state shaped by those who came before and leaves its own mark for those who follow. From the first Native communities along the rivers of the Ohio Valley to the modern cities and industries of today, Indiana has constantly evolved while remaining unmistakably itself. It is a state built by explorers, pioneers, farmers, workers, immigrants, soldiers, entrepreneurs, teachers, athletes, and dreamers. Their stories together form the history of Indiana. And the next chapter is already beginning. Epilogue: The Heartland State. As our journey through Indiana comes to an end, it is worth pausing for a moment and imagining the countless generations of people who have called this land home. Long before cities rose from the plains or highways crossed the countryside, Native peoples traveled along rivers that still flow today. They hunted in forests that stretched beyond the horizon. They built communities, traded across vast distances, and developed cultures deeply connected to the land. Their story formed the first chapter of Indiana's history, and their legacy remains woven into the landscape even now. Then came explorers paddling through unfamiliar waterways, fur traders carrying goods between worlds, and settlers seeking opportunity on the frontier. Indiana became a meeting place of cultures, ambitions, and competing visions of the future. It witnessed conflict and cooperation, triumph and tragedy. The forests echoed with the voices of Native leaders such as Tecumseh, whose dream of unity remains one of the most remarkable stories in American history. The frontier eventually gave way to farms and towns. Wilderness became communities. Dirt paths became roads. Roads became railroads. Railroads connected Indiana to a growing nation. Generations of pioneers labored tirelessly to transform possibility into reality. Their work required courage, determination, and an almost stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The state they built would soon produce one of the most influential figures in American history. A young boy who split rails and borrowed books in southern Indiana grew up to become Abraham Lincoln. His story reminds us that greatness often emerges from the most humble beginnings. Indiana's history has never been solely about powerful leaders or famous events. It has always been about ordinary people confronting extraordinary challenges. Farmers, factory workers, immigrants, teachers, soldiers, entrepreneurs, and families all helped shape the state's identity. During the Civil War, Hoosiers fought to preserve the Union. During the Industrial Age, they built factories that powered economic growth. During the Great Depression, they endured hardship with resilience and determination. During World War II, they contributed to a global struggle that reshaped the modern world. Through every era, Indiana adapted, evolved, and moved forward. The state also confronted difficult chapters: social conflict, political corruption, discrimination, and economic upheaval tested communities and institutions. Yet, history is not valuable because it tells us only about success. It is valuable because it reveals how people respond to challenges, mistakes, and uncertainty. Indiana's story includes moments of pride and moments of reflection, just as the American story does. And perhaps that is why Indiana feels so uniquely representative of the nation itself. In many ways, the history of Indiana mirrors the history of America. It is a story of exploration and settlement, of conflict and compromise, of innovation and adaptation, of diversity, ambition, and reinvention. It is a story of people arriving from different places and working to build something larger than themselves. Today, Indiana remains a state of farms and factories, universities and businesses, basketball gyms and racetracks, small towns and growing cities. It honors traditions while embracing change. It remembers its past while looking toward the future. The rivers still flow. The seasons still change. New generations continue writing their own chapters in a story that began thousands of years ago. And so we leave Indiana not as a place frozen in history, but as a living, evolving community shaped by all who came before. From the first peoples of the Ohio Valley to the innovators of the modern age, each generation has added its voice to the story. Together, they created the Heartland State. And like America itself, its story is still being written.